One cold night in Willow Ridge, a young boy stumbles upon a burning car, and what he does next will change his life forever. But instead of praise, he's met with suspicion, doubt, and a whirlwind of challenges. How did a single act of courage turn a quiet teenager into a hometown hero? And what secrets does this story hold that will leave you speechless? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The moon hung low over Willow Ridge, its faint glow illuminating the quiet streets of the small Colorado town. It was nearing 10 p.m., and the air carried a biting chill, the kind that seeped into your bones and stayed there. Ezra Coleman pulled his jacket tighter around his slim frame as he pedaled his rusty bike along the deserted sidewalk. The faint creak of the chain echoed softly in the silence, a lonely sound in an otherwise still night. At just 14 years old, Ezra was already well acquainted with responsibility. Tonight, like many others, he had delivered a care package for Mrs. Henley, an elderly widow down the street. His mother, Grace Coleman, had asked him to help after finishing her shift at the local hospital. Grace was a nurse, kind-hearted but often exhausted, working long hours to make ends meet. Ezra didn't mind pitching in. He knew how hard she worked to provide for the two of them. The Coleman household wasn't much, just a small, weathered bungalow on the edge of town. But it was home. Grace often said that what their home lacked in size, it made up for in love, though lately, Ezra had noticed the tired lines forming around her eyes. He had made it his silent mission to lighten her load whenever possible, even if it meant riding his old bike late into the night. As Ezra turned onto Summit Avenue, the quiet comfort of routine was shattered by a loud, metallic crunch. His bike wobbled as he instinctively hit the brakes, eyes darting to the source of the noise. Up ahead, near the curve of the road, lay a mangled SUV, its front end crumpled against a tree. Smoke billowed from the hood, twisting and curling into the icy night sky. Ezra froze, heart pounding in his chest. His first instinct was to turn back, to get help, but then he heard it. A faint, desperate cry for help. "Someone, please!" The voice was weak, barely audible over the hiss of steam escaping the engine. Ezra's breath caught. He swallowed hard, the sharp taste of fear rising in his throat. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to find an adult who could handle this. But as he stood there, the cries grew fainter, more desperate. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling heavier than the last. He thought of his mother, how she always told him that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Gritting his teeth, Ezra dropped his bike and sprinted toward the wreck. His sneakers skidded slightly on the icy pavement as he approached, the acrid smell of burning oil filling his nose. The front of the SUV was a twisted mess, the windshield spiderwebbed with cracks. Smoke was seeping through the gaps in the hood, and Ezra could see the flicker of orange flames licking the edges of the engine. Inside, slumped against the driver's seat, was a woman in a police uniform. Her blonde hair was matted with blood, and her face was pale. Ezra recognized her immediately. Sarah Whitmore, the town's police chief. He had seen her at community events, handing out safety pamphlets or shaking hands with townsfolk. She was a figure of authority, someone who seemed untouchable, yet here she was, vulnerable and trapped. "Help! Please!" Sarah's eyes fluttered open briefly, her voice barely a whisper. Ezra's pulse raced. He tugged at the driver's side door, but it wouldn't budge. His fingers fumbled for the handle, pulling with all his might, but it was jammed tight. He glanced toward the flames, which were growing more insistent, creeping closer to the fuel tank. "Think, Ezra, think," he muttered to himself, panic threatening to overtake him. His gaze darted around until it landed on a thick branch lying a few feet away. Without hesitating, he grabbed it, using all his strength to smash the window. The glass shattered with a deafening crack, spraying tiny shards everywhere. "Ma'am, I'm here. I'm going to get you out," Ezra shouted, his voice steadier than he felt. He reached through the broken window, fumbling with the seatbelt latch. It finally gave way, and Sarah slumped forward. Ezra hooked his arms under hers, gritting his teeth as he tried to pull her out of the car. She was heavier than he expected, her body limp and unresponsive. The heat from the engine grew unbearable, the flames now roaring hungrily. Ezra could feel the sweat on his forehead freezing in the night air as he dragged Sarah away from the vehicle, his legs shaking with the effort. He stumbled, almost falling, but he didn't stop until they were a safe distance away. Behind him, the SUV erupted in a blinding fireball, the force of the explosion knocking him to the ground. He shielded Sarah's body with his own, the heat searing against his back even from a distance. For a moment, the world was silent except for the crackling of flames and the pounding of his heart. Ezra pushed himself up, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sarah lay on the icy ground, her chest rising and falling shallowly. She was alive. "Stay with me," Ezra whispered, his voice trembling. "Help is coming." In the distance, the faint wail of sirens pierced the stillness. Relief washed over Ezra, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of fear. What would he tell them? Would they even believe him? The sharp wail of sirens grew louder, the red and blue lights painting the trees and icy ground in flickering streaks. Ezra Coleman stayed crouched next to Sarah Whitmore, his fingers trembling as he clutched the hem of her jacket. Her breathing was shallow, but she was alive, a fact that brought a faint sense of relief amid the chaos. "Hold on," he murmured softly, his voice shaky. "They're almost here." When the first responder vehicle screeched to a halt, firefighters leapt out, racing toward the smoldering wreckage of the SUV. An EMT approached Ezra, his medical bag in hand, and knelt beside Sarah. "Step back, son," the EMT said gently but firmly, guiding Ezra aside. Ezra stumbled to his feet, his legs weak from exhaustion. She was trapped," Ezra stammered, pointing at the wreckage. "I pulled her out before it exploded." The EMT didn't respond. Already busy checking Sarah's vitals, Ezra backed away further, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the chaos unfold. Firefighters doused the burning SUV, and another EMT team placed Sarah on a stretcher, strapping her in carefully before wheeling her toward the ambulance. For a moment, Ezra felt invisible amidst the frenzy. No one asked him who he was or how he had been involved. He was just a boy standing in the freezing cold, watching the scene play out as though it were a distant dream. But then, one of the officers, Deputy Rick Nolan, a stocky man with a gruff demeanor, turned his attention to Ezra. His eyes narrowed as he took in the boy's soot-streaked face and trembling frame. "You!" Deputy Nolan barked, walking toward him. "What are you doing here?" Ezra's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His mind raced, trying to find the right words, but the intensity of the deputy's gaze froze them in his throat. I was riding home, and I saw the car," Ezra finally managed to say. "I heard her calling for help, so I—" "You heard her?" Nolan interrupted, his voice sharp. "How'd you get her out?" "I broke the window," Ezra replied, his voice growing steadier. "The door wouldn't open, so I—" "You broke the window?" Nolan's tone turned accusatory. He stepped closer, towering over Ezra. "What were you doing out here this late, huh?" Ezra's stomach tightened. I was just riding home. I wasn't—" "Rick, that's enough," came a calmer voice. Detective Alan Harper, a tall man with a worn leather jacket and kind eyes, approached. He glanced at Ezra, then back at Nolan. "He's just a kid. Let's hear him out." Nolan hesitated but stepped back, his expression hard. Harper knelt slightly to meet Ezra's eye level. "Son, I'm Detective Harper," he said, his voice gentler. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Ezra nodded, his words spilling out quickly. He recounted everything, seeing the SUV, hearing Sarah's cries, smashing the window, and pulling her out just before the explosion. Harper listened intently, his brow furrowed as he processed the details. "You're saying you saved Chief Whitmore?" Harper asked, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. Ezra nodded again. "Yes, sir. She was stuck. I couldn't just leave her." Harper stood, crossing his arms as he glanced toward the ambulance where Sarah was being loaded in. Nolan snorted, shaking his head. "Pretty convenient, don't you think? Kid shows up out of nowhere, car's on fire, and now he's the hero." "Rick," Harper warned, his tone firm. "We don't know anything yet." Ezra's chest tightened. He had hoped they would believe him, that the truth of his actions would be enough. But now, under Nolan's scrutinizing glare, doubt began to creep in. He looked down at his hands, still raw and stinging from breaking the glass, and clenched them into fists. "She's alive because of me," Ezra said quietly, his voice tinged with frustration. "I didn't do anything wrong." Harper studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, son. Why don't you come with me to the station? We just need to get your statement, make sure everything's straightened out. Ezra hesitated. The idea of going to the police station made his stomach churn, but Harper's tone lacked the harshness of Nolan's. It sounded almost like an invitation, not a demand. I need to let my mom know, Ezra said finally. You can call her from the station, Harper replied, motioning for him to follow. Ezra reluctantly walked toward Harper's unmarked car, his bike abandoned by the side of the road. As he slid into the back seat, he caught one last glimpse of Sarah being lifted into the ambulance, her face pale but peaceful. A sliver of hope flickered in his chest. Maybe when she woke up, she would tell them what really happened. The car door shut with a heavy thud, and for the first time, Ezra felt the weight of the night's events press down on him. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a hollow ache in his chest. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? So why did it feel like he was the one in trouble? The car pulled away, the flashing lights of the scene fading into the distance. Ezra stared out the window, his reflection faint against the darkness outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The police station in Willow Ridge was small, a modest brick building that stood at the edge of the town square. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the worn linoleum floors. Ezra sat on a hard plastic chair in the corner of the waiting area, his knees bouncing nervously. His hands were still dirty from the night's events, the faint smell of smoke lingering on his clothes. Detective Harper sat across the room at a desk, flipping through a notepad as he glanced occasionally at Ezra. Deputy Nolan loomed nearby, arms crossed, his skeptical gaze fixed on the boy. "All right, kid," Harper said finally, standing and motioning for Ezra to follow. "Let's get your statement. You'll feel better once everything's on record." Ezra hesitated, his stomach churning. "I need to call my mom first," he said quietly. "She's going to be worried." "Fine," Harper said, gesturing toward a phone on the wall. "Go ahead." Ezra dialed quickly, his fingers shaking as he punched in the familiar number. It rang twice before Grace Coleman's tired but warm voice answered. "Ezra? Is that you? Where are you, honey?" she asked, her tone immediately filled with concern. "Mom, I'm at the police station," Ezra admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "Something happened. What?" Grace interrupted, her voice rising. "What are you doing there? Are you okay? Did someone hurt you?" "I'm fine," Ezra said quickly, though the knot in his chest tightened. "I'll explain everything when you get here. Can you come now?" "I'm on my way," Grace said firmly, her voice steady despite the urgency. "Stay put. Don't say anything until I get there." Ezra hung up and turned back to Harper, who was watching him with a neutral expression. "She's coming," Ezra said. "Good," Harper replied. "In the meantime, let's get started. Come with me." In the small interrogation room, Harper motioned for Ezra to take a seat at a metal table. The room was bare except for the table, 2 chairs, and a small recorder placed in the center. Harper sat across from him, flipping open his notepad. "All right, Ezra," Harper began, his tone calm. "Just tell me everything that happened tonight, from the beginning. Take your time." Ezra recounted the events once more, his voice trembling as he described the crash, the flames, and Sarah's faint cries for help. He spoke about breaking the window and pulling her out, his words quickening as he relived the urgency of the moment. "I didn't know what else to do," Ezra finished, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "She was trapped. I just wanted to help." Harper nodded, scribbling notes as Ezra spoke. When the boy fell silent, Harper leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the notepad. "You're saying you were just passing by?" Harper asked, his tone even. "Yes, sir," Ezra replied. "I was riding home from helping Mrs. Henley. She lives down the street from me." "Did you see anyone else near the scene before you got there?" Harper pressed. Ezra shook his head. "No, it was just me in the car." Harper sighed, his gaze shifting to the recorder for a moment before returning to Ezra. "Okay," he said. "Thanks for telling me all that. Sit tight for a minute." As Harper stood and left the room, Deputy Nolan entered, closing the door behind him. His presence filled the small space, and his sharp gaze settled on Ezra like a weight. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" Nolan said, his voice low and cutting. "Just happened to be in the right place at the right time, huh?" Ezra blinked, unsure how to respond. I just wanted to help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Convenient story, Nolan muttered, leaning on the table. A kid like you, out that late near a car crash, doesn't add up. I didn't do anything wrong, Ezra said, his tone firmer this time. I saved her. Before Nolan could say more, the door opened again, and Grace Coleman walked in. Her eyes darted to Ezra, relief and anger flashing across her face. Ezra! She called, rushing toward him. Her voice was a mixture of relief and panic. She dropped to her knees in front of him, her hands gripping his shoulders tightly. What happened? Are you hurt? Why are you here? Ezra's mouth opened, but no words came out. How could he explain? His mind was still replaying the explosion, the heat, the weight of Sarah Whitmore's body as he dragged her away from the flames. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? But now, sitting here, under the watchful eyes of the police, it all felt unreal. Detective Harper approached, clearing his throat. Mrs. Coleman? Grace stood, placing herself between Ezra and the detective, her eyes flashing with protective determination. I'm his mother, she said firmly. What's going on here? Why is my son at a police station? Harper held up his hands, his voice calm. Ma'am, your son was found at the scene of a car accident tonight. We're just trying to figure out what happened. A car accident? Grace repeated, her brows knitting together. She turned to Ezra. What were you doing there? You were supposed to be on your way home. I was, Ezra stammered, his voice barely audible. I saw the car. It was on fire, and Harper interjected gently. We're not accusing him of anything, Mrs. Coleman. We just need to understand why he was there and what he saw. Grace turned back to the detective, her voice rising. You need to understand. My son is 14. He's a good boy. He shouldn't be here answering questions without me. Mom, Ezra whispered, his eyes pleading. It's okay. No, it's not okay, Grace said sharply, her voice trembling. What's this really about? Did someone accuse him of something? Before Harper could respond, Deputy Nolan stepped forward, his tone sharper than Harper's. Look, ma'am, we're just trying to make sense of things. Your boy was at the scene of an accident involving the police chief. We need answers. Grace's face paled. The police chief? What? What happened to her? She's in the hospital, Harper replied. Alive, thanks to someone. We're just trying to figure out if your son saw anything, or knows anything, that can help us piece it together. Grace's eyes darted to Ezra, searching his face for answers. Ezra, did you see what happened? Ezra hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain how he had been the one to pull Sarah Whitmore from the wreckage. But the words stuck in his throat. What if she didn't believe him? What if no one did? I didn't do anything wrong, Ezra said softly, his voice shaking. Grace frowned, her worry deepening. Of course you didn't. But then why— Mrs. Coleman, Harper interrupted gently. Can we take your son's statement? It's just procedure. Grace's jaw tightened, her maternal instincts flaring. Fine, she said, but I'm staying right here. Inside the small interrogation room, the air felt heavier. Harper sat across from Ezra at a metal table, his notepad open in front of him. Grace sat beside her son, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Ezra, Harper began, his voice calm. Can you walk me through what happened tonight? Take your time. Ezra looked down at his hands, which were resting on the table. They were still smudged with soot, the faint marks of Sarah's blood staining his fingertips. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper, as he began to speak. I was riding my bike home, Ezra said. I saw a car. It had crashed into a tree and it was smoking. I heard someone calling for help. He paused, his throat tightening. Grace's grip on his shoulder tightened in silent encouragement. I went closer, he continued. I saw her inside. She was trapped, and the door wouldn't open. The fire was getting bigger, so I broke the window. I pulled her out before the car exploded. Harper's pen paused over his notepad. You're saying you saved Chief Whitmore? He asked, his tone measured. Ezra nodded. Yes, sir. Harper exchanged a glance with Nolan, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Convenient story, Nolan muttered under his breath. Rick, Harper warned, his tone sharp. Grace's eyes widened, her confusion giving way to anger. Wait, she said, her voice rising. Are you saying my son saved her? Why didn't you tell me that? We're just verifying the details, Harper said carefully. We have to be thorough. He just told you what happened, Grace snapped. Why don't you believe him? Harper sighed, rubbing his temple. It's not about believing or not believing, Mrs. Coleman. It's about making sure we have all the facts. Grace opened her mouth to argue, but Harper's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting as he read the message. What is it? Nolan asked. Harper stood, his movements brisk. Someone uploaded a video from the crash scene, he said, his voice tight. It's going viral. Outside the room, Harper played the video on his phone for Nolan. The footage, though shaky, was clear. Ezra sprinting toward the burning SUV, breaking the window and pulling Sarah Whitmore out moments before the explosion. The sound of bystanders gasping and murmuring could be heard in the background. This changes things, Harper said, his tone firm. Nolan crossed his arms, his expression hard to read. Maybe. Or maybe it just raises more questions. Harper frowned. Seriously, Rick? What more do you need? The kid risked his life to save hers. Nolan shrugged. I'm just saying, there's still a lot we don't know. What was he doing out there to begin with? And why hasn't Chief Whitmore confirmed his story? Because she's unconscious in a hospital bed, Harper snapped. You saw the video. This kid's telling the truth. Nolan opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when Harper turned away. I'm showing this to Mrs. Coleman, Harper said over his shoulder. She deserves to know. When Harper re-entered the interrogation room, Grace was still holding Ezra, her face a mixture of defiance and relief. She looked up as Harper approached, her eyes narrowing. Detective, she began, her tone sharp. If you're going to accuse my son of something, you better have more than your suspicions. Harper held up his phone, his expression softening. Mrs. Coleman, I think you'll want to see this. He placed the phone on the table and hit play. The room filled with the sounds of the video, the roar of flames, Ezra's desperate grunts as he broke the window, and the crack of glass shattering. Grace's hand flew to her chest as she watched, her eyes wide with shock. Oh my God, she whispered. Ezra! Ezra shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his cheeks flushing. It's not a big deal, Mom. Not a big deal? Grace exclaimed, her voice rising. You saved someone's life. You could have been... She stopped, her voice breaking, and took a deep breath. You're incredible, she finished softly, tears spilling over. Harper gave them a moment before speaking. This video is already making rounds on social media, he said. People are calling your son a hero. Ezra's head snapped up, his eyes wide. What? It's true, Harper said with a faint smile. And they're right. Grace looked at Harper, her expression shifting to one of cautious hope. Does this mean he's not in trouble? Harper nodded. It means we're clearing him. I'll make sure of it. Ezra exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing over him. But before he could fully process the words, Nolan walked back into the room, his expression as stony as ever. Don't celebrate just yet, Nolan said. There's still the matter of why the chief hasn't corroborated his story. Grace stood, her hands clenched at her sides. She's unconscious, she said coldly. What do you expect her to say? She might not be for long, Nolan retorted. We'll see what she remembers. Harper stepped in, his voice calm but firm. That's enough, Rick. This boy's done nothing wrong. We're not holding him any longer. Nolan grunted but didn't argue further, leaving the room with a dismissive wave. Harper turned back to Grace and Ezra, his expression softening. You can go home now, Harper said, but don't be surprised if you hear from reporters. This video's gaining a lot of attention. Grace nodded, taking Ezra's hand. Thank you, Detective, she said, her voice steady, for believing him. I don't think I had much of a choice, Harper replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The truth has a way of making itself known. As Grace and Ezra stepped out into the cold night air, the weight of the evening began to lift. Ezra glanced up at his mother, his voice quiet. Mom, what happens now? Grace wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. We go home, she said simply, and we take it one day at a time. Ezra nodded, his heart still heavy but lighter than before. He had done the right thing. Now, he just had to hope that the world would see it too. The morning sun broke over Willow Ridge, casting golden rays on the small houses and quiet streets. For most residents, it was an ordinary day, but for Ezra Coleman, it felt anything but. Sitting at the kitchen table in their modest home, Ezra stared blankly at his cereal. The events of the previous night played over and over in his mind like a broken record. His mother, Grace, bustled around the kitchen, her movements quick and purposeful. She had taken the day off from her nursing shift, determined to stay close to Ezra after everything that had happened. Her phone buzzed on the counter, lighting up with a flood of notifications, texts, emails, and missed calls. The video of Ezra rescuing Sarah Whitmore had gone viral overnight, and now the world wanted to know more about the boy who had risked his life to save the police chief. Grace glanced at her phone but didn't pick it up. Instead, she turned to Ezra, her eyes softening. "You've hardly touched your breakfast," she said gently. "I'm not hungry," Ezra muttered, pushing the bowl away. Grace sighed and pulled out the chair beside him, sitting down. "I know it's a lot, sweetheart," she said, "but you need to eat something. You'll feel better." Ezra didn't respond. His thoughts were too tangled to form words. What if people didn't believe the video? What if the police still thought he had something to do with the crash? And what about Chief Whitmore? Would she even remember what he had done for her? At the same time, across town, Sarah Whitmore lay in a hospital bed, her body battered but slowly healing. The sterile white walls of her room felt stifling, a stark contrast to the chaos of the crash. She had woken up hours earlier, disoriented and in pain, with fragmented memories of the night before swirling in her mind. As she stared at the ceiling, trying to piece it all together, the door opened and Detective Harper stepped in, holding a tablet under his arm. "Morning, Chief," Harper said, his tone lighter than usual. "Good to see you awake." Sarah turned her head slowly, wincing at the movement. "Harper," she rasped, her voice hoarse. "What happened?" "You don't remember?" Harper asked, his brow furrowing. "I remember the crash," Sarah said, her expression distant. "I remember flames and someone pulling me out." Her eyes narrowed. "Who was it?" Harper smiled faintly and set the tablet on her bedside table. "See for yourself." With trembling fingers, Sarah picked up the device and hit play. The video began, shaky but clear, showing a boy sprinting toward the burning SUV. She watched as he broke the window, his silhouette illuminated by the firelight, and pulled her free just seconds before the vehicle exploded. "Ezra Coleman," Harper said as the video ended, 14 years old, "he's the reason you're still here." Sarah stared at the screen, her chest tightening. She had seen Ezra around town, a quiet kid, polite but reserved. She never imagined he would be capable of something so heroic. Guilt gnawed at her as she remembered the fleeting moment when she had doubted him, questioned whether he was a bystander or something more sinister. "I need to talk to him," Sarah said firmly, her voice regaining strength. "I need to thank him." Harper nodded. "I thought you might say that. I'll make it happen." Later that afternoon, Ezra was sitting on the front porch steps, watching the leaves sway gently in the breeze, when a car pulled up in front of the house. The passenger door opened, and Sarah Whitmore stepped out, her movements slow but determined. She wore plain clothes, her arm in a sling, but there was an unmistakable authority in her presence. Ezra's heart leapt into his throat as she approached. Grace, who had been watering the plants in the yard, looked up in surprise. "Chief Whitmore," Grace said cautiously, setting the watering can down. "What brings you here?" Sarah gave a small, apologetic smile. "I came to see Ezra," she said, "if that's all right." Grace hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let Sarah pass. Ezra stood as she approached, his hands shoved into his pockets, unsure of what to say. "Ezra," Sarah began, her voice soft, "I wanted to thank you." Ezra blinked, taken aback. "Thank me?" "For saving my life," Sarah said simply. "I remember now. What you did, it was brave, and I owe you everything." Ezra shrugged, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I just did what anyone would have done." Sarah shook her head. "No, Ezra. Most people would have run the other way, but you ran toward danger. You didn't just save me, you reminded me what courage looks like." Ezra's eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for the first time, he saw not the imposing police chief, but a person, a vulnerable, grateful person. "I'm sorry for what happened at the station," Sarah continued, her voice heavy with regret. You shouldn't have been treated like that. I should have spoken up sooner, but I didn't know how. Ezra shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Grace stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Ezra, she said gently, maybe this is your chance to tell her how you feel. Ezra hesitated, then took a deep breath. I just wanted to help, he said quietly. But I didn't think anyone would believe me. I thought maybe it didn't matter. It matters, Sarah said firmly. It matters more than you know, and I'm going to make sure everyone understands that. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small polished badge. This is mine, she said, holding it out to Ezra. I want you to have it, as a reminder of what you did and what you're capable of. Ezra stared at the badge, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Slowly, he reached out and took it, the cool metal warm in his hands. Thank you, he murmured. No, Sarah said with a smile. Thank you. The town square of Willow Ridge had never been so full of life. Rows of folding chairs lined the cobblestone streets, while a makeshift stage adorned with banners and fairy lights stood at the center. The banner overhead read in bold letters, Honoring Our Local Hero. Ezra stood off to the side of the square, fidgeting nervously with the collar of his button-down shirt. He had never been the center of attention before, and the thought of standing in front of so many people made his stomach twist. Beside him, his mother, Grace, adjusted his tie with a proud but reassuring smile. You'll do great, she said softly. Just be yourself. I don't know if I can do this, Ezra muttered, glancing at the growing crowd. Familiar faces filled the square, his neighbors, his teachers, even Mrs. Henley from down the street, sitting proudly in the front row. You already did the hard part, sweetheart, Grace said, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. This is just the part where they get to thank you. Ezra swallowed hard and nodded, though his nerves didn't settle. From the stage, Detective Harper waved him over, motioning for him to take his place. Go on, Grace urged gently, giving him a small push. Ezra made his way to the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. As he stepped up, the crowd erupted into applause, the sound thunderous in his ears. He froze for a moment, overwhelmed. But then Harper clapped a hand on his shoulder. You've got this, kid, Harper said with a grin. Just breathe. Ezra nodded and stepped up to the microphone. The applause died down, leaving an expectant hush over the crowd. Ezra's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edges of the podium. He began, his voice shaky. He cleared his throat and tried again. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for being here. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. For a moment, he saw not a sea of strangers, but a community. People who had come together, not just for him, but for something bigger. I didn't do what I did to be a hero, Ezra continued, his voice gaining strength. I didn't even think about it. I just knew someone needed help, and I couldn't walk away. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ezra glanced down at the badge Sarah Whitmore had given him, which he had pinned to his shirt. He took a deep breath, his next words carefully chosen. My mom always tells me that we don't have to be big or strong to make a difference, he said. We just have to care. And I think that's what this town is all about. Willow Ridge is a small place, but it's full of people who care. The crowd broke into applause again, and this time Ezra smiled. Harper stepped forward and took the microphone. Ezra Coleman showed us all what true courage looks like, Harper said, his voice carrying easily across the square, and it's only right that we recognize that. He gestured toward the side of the stage where Sarah Whitmore stood. She was out of uniform, her arms still in a sling, but her presence commanded attention. She stepped forward, holding a small velvet box in her good hand. Ezra, she began, her voice clear and steady. On behalf of the Willow Ridge Police Department and the entire community, it's my honor to present you with this commendation for bravery. She opened the box to reveal a gleaming medal, its surface catching the light. The crowd erupted into cheers as Sarah leaned down to pin the medal onto Ezra's shirt. You've earned this, Sarah said softly, her gaze meeting his. Thank you. Ezra nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. He glanced toward the crowd, catching sight of his mother wiping away tears, and felt a surge of pride. After the ceremony, the square buzzed with life as people gathered to congratulate Ezra and share their own stories of courage and kindness. Kids ran up to him, their eyes wide with admiration. "You're a real hero," one boy exclaimed. "I want to be like you when I grow up," said another. Ezra smiled, his initial shyness melting away under their enthusiasm. "You don't have to wait to be a hero," he told them. "You just have to care about people." The words stuck with the kids, and they nodded earnestly before running off to play. Meanwhile, Grace watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride as she saw her son come into his own. Nearby, Sarah approached Grace, holding 2 cups of coffee. "For the proud mom," Sarah said with a small smile, handing Grace a cup. Grace chuckled softly, taking the coffee. "I'm still getting used to it," she admitted. "All this attention. He deserves every bit of it," Sarah said firmly. She glanced toward Ezra, who was laughing with a group of kids. "You raised a remarkable son, Grace." "Thank you," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." Sarah hesitated, then added, "And I owe you both an apology for everything. The way Ezra was treated at the station, it wasn't right." Grace placed a hand on Sarah's arm, her expression kind. "What matters is that you're here now," she said, "and that you see him for who he really is." Sarah nodded, gratitude shining in her eyes. "I do," she said simply. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the square in warm hues of orange and pink, Ezra stood with his mother, gazing at the crowd of familiar faces. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly seen, not as a quiet boy from a small town, but as someone who had made a difference. "You did good, kid," Grace said, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Ezra smiled, leaning into her embrace. "I just wanted to help," he said softly. "And you did," Grace replied. "More than you know." The days following the ceremony were a whirlwind of attention and change for Ezra Coleman. The story of his bravery had spread far beyond Willow Ridge, drawing interest from reporters, charities, and even local government officials. But amid the noise, Ezra found himself longing for the quiet simplicity of his life before the fire, the late-night bike rides, the small-town rhythms, and the peaceful anonymity. He stood at the window of their home one Saturday morning, looking out at the familiar streets. The badge and medal Sarah had given him sat on the coffee table behind him, catching the sunlight streaming through the curtains. They were symbols of something he still wasn't sure how to process. Ezra sat on the steps, a notebook in his lap, sketching out ideas for his future. The medal he'd received during the ceremony gleamed beside him, a constant reminder of the night that changed everything. His mother, Grace, stepped out onto the porch with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, one for herself, one filled with cocoa for Ezra. "Planning your next big adventure?" Grace teased, sitting beside him. "Maybe," Ezra replied with a small smile, "just thinking about what's next." Before Grace could respond, the sound of a car pulling into their driveway broke the quiet. Ezra and Grace exchanged a glance as they saw Sarah Whitmore step out, her arm still in a sling, but her stride as purposeful as ever. She carried a folder under her good arm, her expression warm but determined. "Chief Whitmore," Grace said, standing as Sarah approached, "to what do we owe this visit?" Sarah smiled, setting the folder down on the porch railing. "Please, call me Sarah, and I'm here because I owe both of you more than words can say." Grace tilted her head, confused. "You've already thanked Ezra," she said. "More than enough." Sarah shook her head. "Not enough," she said firmly. "You both deserve more." "Ezra," her tone earnest, "what you did that night, it changed my life, and it reminded me of the responsibility I have, not just as a police chief, but as a person." Ezra shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where the conversation was headed. Grace reached over and squeezed his hand, silently encouraging him to listen. "I know how hard you and your mom work to make ends meet," Sarah continued, her gaze moving to Grace. "And I know that sometimes opportunities feel out of reach because of finances. That's why I've decided to help." She opened the folder, revealing a set of documents. "I've set up a fund to cover Ezra's education, high school, college, whatever path he chooses. And," she added, turning to Grace, "I'd also like to help with your nursing certification. You've given so much to this community, Grace. It's time someone gave something back to you." The room fell silent. Ezra's mouth hung open in disbelief, and Grace's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say, Grace whispered, her voice breaking. It's too much. It's not too much, Sarah said firmly. It's what you deserve. Ezra saved my life, and through him, I've learned what it means to truly invest in others. This is the least I can do. Ezra looked at his mother, then back at Sarah. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. We'll be okay. I know you will, Sarah replied, her smile gentle. But this isn't about charity, Ezra. It's about paying forward the kindness and bravery you've shown. You've already changed my life. Let me help change yours. Grace wiped her eyes, struggling to find the right words. Thank you, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Sarah reached out and placed a hand over Grace's. You've raised an incredible son, she said. This town is better because of both of you. In the weeks that followed, the funds Sarah had established began to make a tangible difference. Ezra's school books and supplies were fully covered, and Grace was able to reduce her work hours to focus on furthering her nursing career. For the first time in years, the Colemans felt a sense of stability and hope. Ezra stood in his room, the medal Sarah had given him resting on his desk. He reached for his notebook and wrote down the words that had been lingering in his heart. Sometimes, the smallest acts of courage can open the biggest doors. He closed the notebook, smiling to himself. Tomorrow was a new day, and for the first time, the future felt as bright as the stars outside his window. With Grace's encouragement and Sarah's guidance, Ezra applied to a local firefighter cadet program. He spent months training, pushing himself to his limits, and learning everything he could about the job. On his first day as a junior firefighter, Ezra stood in his crisp uniform, a mixture of nerves and excitement coursing through him. As he walked into the firehouse, he spotted Sarah waiting near the entrance, her arm fully healed and her trademark confidence intact. Ready to make a difference? She asked with a grin. Ezra nodded, his chest swelling with pride. Ready. Over time, Ezra found his place in the firehouse, forming bonds with his fellow firefighters and earning their respect. Sarah, true to her word, stayed involved in his journey, often working alongside him in community outreach programs. Together, they became a symbol of resilience and teamwork in Willow Ridge. Years later, as Ezra stood in front of a classroom of young cadets, sharing his story of how one night had changed his life, he saw their faces light up with inspiration. Sarah watched from the back of the room, a proud smile on her face. When the session ended, one of the cadets approached Ezra. "Do you ever regret what happened that night?" they asked. Ezra thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Not for a second," he said. "Because that night, I learned something important. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about caring enough to act, even when you're scared. And that's what makes all the difference." As the cadet nodded, Ezra glanced at Sarah, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. Together, they had faced the fire, both literal and metaphorical, and come out stronger. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.